Hello, I'm Steve Nash. I'm a history professor at East Tennessee State University and the president of Mountain History and Culture Group, a support board for the Zebulon Vance Birthplace State Historic Site in Weaverville, North Carolina. It is in that capacity that I bring to you today another episode of our web series, Quarantined Historians, Maybe or Maybe Not Drinking Coffee. And today's conversation is another piece in our ongoing look at the history of enslavement and race relations in Asheville and Buncombe County, North Carolina. Our guest is Katherine Calhoun Cutshall. Katherine is the collections manager at the North Carolina Room in Pack Memorial Library in downtown Asheville, North Carolina. She has done extensive research on enslavement in Buncombe County and Asheville, and she is also leading the Black Asheville History Project, a work by the North Carolina Room to build a stronger collection of African American history. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by Katherine Calhoun Cutshall.
So we're here today with Katherine Cutshall, who is the manager at the North Carolina Room at Pack Library. You've done a lot of research on the history of slavery in Buncombe County in Western North Carolina. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So for starters, I think in the current moment that we're all living, one of the things that you can't escape in a lot of the sort of commentary and social media and things that are going on is this sort of ongoing myth about the fact that people claiming that slavery just didn't exist within Southern Appalachia or didn't exist within Western North Carolina. And we obviously know that that's not true. But on that front, I'd like to ask you, how did that myth come to be? How did that myth start? And why do you think it continues to persist today?
It really got started with travel writers in the late 1800s who, many of whom were women and were writing for popular magazines. The magazine was kind of a new, fun thing. People had greater access to mail service. And so women in particular were visiting Western North Carolina and writing, for the most part, fictionalized narratives of their time vacationing here. And they basically erased the fact that there were African Americans living in Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, any part of Southern Appalachia altogether. There was really hardly any mention of Black people. These novels were really focused on mountaineers, hillbillies, and sort of advancing the stereotype of the Appalachian other, people who were stuck in time. And so the idea of a people who were stuck in the 18th century helped promote this notion that they were somehow separate, Appalachians were somehow separate from the rest of the South in both their culture and their economics. But that's just really not the case. There were lots of African Americans here, both free and enslaved, from the very beginning of white European settlement in the area. We can go back to the 1790 census, which Buncombe County wasn't exactly on, but we can sort of piece together what Buncombe County would have been. And we can find 10, 15 free people of color, and then another, 25, 30 enslaved people. And so this is before there even is really a Buncombe County. There are African Americans here, both free and enslaved. Later on, that myth persists from folks who were well recognized as kind of scholars of the area. And part of that has to do with the basically ignoring the fact that African Americans were here, and all of the scholarly focus being really on travel and tourism and the hillbilly stereotype. And so in our minds, the hillbilly stereotype is a white guy, a poor white guy at that. And so poor white guys didn't own slaves. So that erasure is just hammered home over and over again.
Where were sort of the early clusters of enslaved people? Where were they living?
That's such a great question. And that's what I've been sort of digging into a little bit more now that I have my consolidated names. I'm now trying to figure out, okay, where were these people living?
Mhm.
And what I think is so interesting is that in 1820, the two largest enslavers, their names were Isaac Tillery and Benjamin Howarth. And they both lived within 10, 15 miles of Paint Rock, which is on the Tennessee line. So, and Howarth was the first person to be given permission to profit off of the Buncombe Turnpike. So Howarth in 1820 enslaved 31 people, and Tillery enslaved 33 people. And so that gives you an idea of like, okay, we're working up to this idea of what a stock stand looks like on the Buncombe Turnpike.
Mhm.
Really, really early tourism. 10 years later, the enslaved people, or the people who enslaved other people, they had really urbanized and consolidated inside the city limits. So by 1830, the number one slave owner in Buncombe County was James Patton Sr., who owned the Eagle Hotel. And right below him is James McConnell Smith, whose home still stands. It's the Smith McDowell House, and it is right outside of Asheville, essentially. And then after that, John Patton, who also owned a hotel. So by the time that you've given these turnpike roads just a few years, what I would call tourism had exploded in Asheville. People were coming for leisure. There were folks who were massive plantation owners in other states who came up here to build their summer homes. The best example of this is the home isn't standing anymore, but it was this huge Georgian, what you think of as a plantation style home on the site of where Christ School is now, and that home is called Struan. And it included 15 residences or homes, shacks for enslaved people. So, it's over time, there are more people coming in from out of town and bringing enslaved people with them, contributing to that population. But also the reason that they wanted to come is because, unlike the way it was described in 1824 as a quaint little place, Asheville was a city. It only took 10 years for it to really feel like an urban place surrounded by all of this wilderness.
And then Woodfin. Nicholas Woodfin, if I remember correctly, was the largest slave owner in the county at the time of the Civil War, when it began in 1860, owned 122, I believe, which, to again put in perspective to people who are watching, 122 enslaved people is a massive fortune. I mean, it's a massive fortune for somebody living in the heart of cotton country. It's a massive fortune for somebody living in Buncombe County, North Carolina in 1860.
Yeah, there's something I want to say that I calculated. He lost about 75% of his total wealth after emancipation.
Yeah.
By the time he passed away, he surprisingly, he was a lawyer and he hadn't left a will. He had his home, his silverware, and his clothing, and that's it.
Yeah, his capital, if you will, is human property. And he made that money off of the bodies, the enslaving of the bodies of people of color. So the geography, I mean, that's really interesting that sort of slavery is consolidating.
Yeah, it urbanizes over time as travel to Western North Carolina becomes more popular, and Asheville is promoted as early as 1816 as a health resort. You could argue that it's even earlier than that when they started the Newton Academy Lottery. There's mention of how great the climate is in Asheville and advertisements for the Newton Academy. But by the 1830s, Asheville really was kind of a tourist destination, a
Mhm.
proto-tourist destination. And enslaved people, the majority of enslaved people, are concentrated in the city, or what we think of as the city today.
Right.
And we're working in some sort of tourism-related business, whether that is, slopping hogs that are part of this stock stand, or as a tanner's assistant inside the Eagle Hotel. Tourism and slavery in Asheville can't be separated.
Mhm.
There were 22 slave owning families that owned at least 15 slaves in 1830. And
Right.
the majority of them have stakes on the Buncombe Turnpike or a hotel in downtown Asheville.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind one of the sort of great points of confusion, and it's really it's a gross mischaracterization, where people identify. I often hear this or hear that people identify the work of enslaved people as free labor, which it fundamentally is not in any way, shape, or form. And I guess because they perceive that the laborer is owned, that therefore the labor is free. Of course, that is forcibly extracted through torture and violence. But then the other part is it denotes this idea that owning enslaved people was sort of accessible. And as you just pointed out, right, the 22 families who owned 15 or more enslaved people were closely connected with the higher ends of wealth and the avenues of wealth collection. As a lot of scholars are now talking about, the sort of development of capitalism, right? The sort of economic development of capitalism in America is connected to slavery, in which enslaved people were the most valuable form of capital in America.
And I think it's important to note too, like I mentioned earlier, that 2% number never budges.
Right.
It's not like someone went and, for lack of a better word, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and suddenly was a part of that elite group of people. There are 332 people in 1830 who own almost all of the wealth. And that's 2% of the people who own almost all of the wealth in Buncombe County. And they aren't really selling it, right? They're keeping it. And I think one of the only kind of tropes about Appalachia that really fits in here is kinship, and how these families were really insulated. They were related in 18, 15, 20, 30 different ways to all of the other 332 slave-owning families. And there's a lot of evidence that slaves weren't bought and sold the same way that they were in other places of the South. Asheville didn't have a big slave market like Charleston did, named Sarah Gudger, who was enslaved by the Hemphill family. Her father's last name was Gudger. And then her mother's last name is McDaniel. Eventually, she goes to live with other Hemphills, and they have a son named McDaniel. So you can see where you've got 4 or 5 different really powerful families who are married to each other 3 or 4 different times. And that transaction of Sarah's mother was not a sale. In fact, the best I can tell, she was a wedding gift.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you see that a lot. The kinship factor, the family factor, is significant. And shout out to a friend of mine who's done a lot of research on Yancey County, Kevin Young, another University of Georgia PhD. He highlights in an article that he wrote, a book chapter, about the way that the McElroy family of Yancey County was connected to the Vance family because Robert Vance married McElroy's daughter. And then when McElroy got into some economic trouble, in order to sort of shield his enslaved property from creditors, he essentially deeded enslaved people to Robert Vance, who then, I believe, And I encourage people to go look it up. It's Kevin Young. It's in a book called Southern Communities, if you want to read about this. But essentially, Robert then deeded these enslaved people to his brother Zebulon, I think more or less for $1, just so that they could put the valuable enslaved property out of reach of creditors. We do well to remember that human beings were once treated as capital and commodities, and that people who were enslavers often used enslaved people as collateral on debts, and that they would put them up to get loans, and they would maneuver them around within their families. I mean, you look at these Western North Carolina families, Candlers, Henrys, that had multiple branches of the family in the same area, were often moving enslaved people from one property to another property. So even though you might have this idea, as was often pointed out, and I think John Inska wrote about this, that, it appeared as if families in Western North Carolina were separated less frequently by sale. That may be true, but that didn't mean that they were not being separated repeatedly. They might still technically be enslaved by the same person, but were living dozens of miles apart from their family members because they were being maneuvered, as you were talking about, where families were shifting them, their enslavers were shifting them to the enslaver's economic benefit, from drover stand to drover stand, or one enterprise to another.
Right, and renting of slaves is a big point. It's hard to track down. There aren't a lot of agreements, but you do see advertisements for people who are either trying to rent out their slaves in the off season, or vice versa. They want to rent someone else's slaves. Right. And the Henry family did this for flax season, as best I can tell. It's what it seems like anyway, from the way that there's a diary entry written about the processing of flax, and that he had brought in 4 or 5 extra enslaved people to do the flax processing. Right. And I think it's important to note too that free people of color put themselves up as collateral. And that became increasingly common after 1830, when the North Carolina Constitution changed and it became illegal to be a free person of color. And one example is a man named James Casey, who was enslaved by the Love family of Haywood County. Casey had essentially deeded himself back to the Loves because he either had to leave the state, which meant leaving his mother and brother, or become a slave again. And so that's what he did. For a pocket watch, he deeded himself back to the Love family. And then once that, this is very close to the Civil War, and then once the I forget which round of conscription acts it was, essentially opened up conscription to free men of color, he found himself in this horrible situation where he had been conscripted by the Confederate Army, but because he was a free man, but was not a free man because he had essentially chatteled himself back to the Love family. And so there's this really interesting court case about how he eventually gets a writ of habeas corpus, but then has to join the army anyway. And the idea is that there's no such thing as a free black person, that Casey, as in the state that he was in legally, was obligated to serve in the Confederate Army.
I believe it was Hal Cobb articulated during the course of the Civil War, which is, this idea that if you're going to argue, it's paraphrasing Hal Cobb, who was a white Georgian enslaver, Confederate officer, basically said that, if you're going to argue that African-American enslaved people can make a good soldier, then the whole structure of slavery is wrong, because their whole argument is built upon African-Americans just needing to be compelled to labor and being controlled and whatnot. If you're going to argue that they can be a soldier, then your whole understanding of race is wrong. It's one of those remarkable moments of sort of like laying bare, like, yeah, what we do is wrong, but we're not going to change it. You're talking about this court case, which is fascinating, and I've not seen it. I'd like to see it. So maybe you could tell me about some of the resources that are out there. You know, if people want to research this history and learn more about the full and complete history of Buncombe County and Asheville and people of color within this community, what sorts of resources are out there for them?
So there's a lot more than you might think. And when you think about finding resources related to enslaved people or formerly enslaved people, what is nice, I guess, is that enslavers have huge collections of papers, and they love to donate them to repositories like mine, like the University of North Carolina, University of South Carolina, University of Tennessee. So, you know, that has been my main source of information about enslaved people, is coming directly from people who were the enslavers. Now, there's more information coming out about individual African American families and people who had been enslaved before, and that's slowly coming out of the woodwork as archives repair their relationship with African American communities, because, like I mentioned before, so many of the archives are built up on the foundation of collections from slave-owning families. The North Carolina Room is no exception. Our foundational collection is the F.A. Saundh collection. That's Foster Alexander Saundh, and the Alexanders and the Davidsons and the Saundhs were all people who owned slaves. And he was certainly informed by that experience, and almost all of his papers sort of speak to his lost cause idea of what, I don't know, the South was, or what he thought it should be. So there's, like I said, there's more coming out about individual enslaved people. Of course, the Federal Writers Project, those interviews with formerly enslaved people are very good. They're a good resource. They should always be taken with a grain of salt. Please read the introductory essay to that collection on the Library of Congress website. Another thing that's recently come out, thanks to our really awesome Register of Deeds, Drew Reisinger, we have a completely digitized and transcribed database of bills of sale for enslaved people in Buncombe County. So that's a really good place to start as well. But the North Carolina Room is working really hard on trying to dig up some of this stuff and to work together with Asheville and Buncombe County's Asheville and Buncombe County's African American community to collect these things now. I feel like this is the last chance we'll really have to try to pull some of the stuff from longstanding African American families in Asheville and Buncombe County. Because, you know, some folks who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, their great-grandparents were enslaved. I think it is so important for us to remember. I mean, there is a gentleman whose name is George Gibson, who has been a caretaker for the South Asheville Cemetery in Kenilworth, who is in his early 90s, I think, but knew Sarah Gudger, who was born in 1816. There are people alive who knew people who were born in 1816, but those people won't be alive for much longer. So we have to get this stuff from them now. We have to work together with the community to say, we don't have your history to share. We want to share it. We want researchers to have access to this. How can you help us do that? Rather than the other way around of let me help you do this thing. That's not what we want to do. We really want to ask the community to help us instead.
Right. You mentioned the work that Drew Reisinger has done with the slave deeds. I believe they also have the cohabitation records, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the cohabitation records aren't, and I think it's important to know that the slave deeds and the cohabitation records are only like small pieces of a very, very big and complex puzzle. Like the cohabitation records aren't going to cover every single instance, and neither are the deeds, right? Like we already talked about, there actually weren't a lot of sales in Buncombe County. So it's important to know that these are only very small pieces that have only very recently sort of been created to be more accessible.
I couldn't have written the book that I wrote in the 1970s. I don't even know that I could have written it in the 1990s. So as more stuff continues to come in and becomes accessible, hope we'll be able to tell more stories.
I mean, a huge part of my research was newspapers.com. I would never have been able to write my first paper on slavery in Buncombe County without newspapers.com. Right. I mean, I guess I could have, but it would have taken me 5 years, not a semester. So that is a huge, huge deal, to just be able to essentially Google a slave owner's name, or the name of a formerly enslaved person, and boom, here's 25 instances that person's appeared in the newspaper. And like you mentioned, being able to track people, like to watch someone like George Avery, or a man named Spence Weaver, who both were soldiers in the 40th North Carolina Infantry, or not 40th North Carolina Infantry, 40th U.S. Colored troops, to watch them become some of the pillars of Asheville's Black community. Spence Weaver and George Avery were both present at the founding of the YMI. And so, you know, having those sorts of digitized and easily indexed, easily searchable records it's a total game changer.
So is there, or are there sort of critical people of color, like important figures, or just fascinating stories that you've uncovered in this research that you'd like to share as we sort of wrap our conversation?
So I mentioned Spence Weaver and George Avery, both of whom are really, really fascinating people. George Avery became the caretaker of the South Asheville Cemetery in Kenilworth, which had originally been part of the Smith McDowell plantation. And it was really interesting to learn more about George Avery, because there was this persistent narrative of William Wallace McDowell had a 19-year-old blacksmith, George Avery. He took him off to war to basically serve as a hand servant. And when McDowell realized that the South was not going to win, he gallantly told George Avery, go, be free, go enlist in the Union Army so that you will have a pension. I was really caught up in that and felt like that couldn't be exactly right. It just felt really lost cause-y. Like, this gallant slave owner has set his slaves free. So I started digging into George Avery's story, and it turns out that that's not the case at all, that George Avery enlisted in the 40th U.S. Colored Troops 2 days after Stoneman's raid in Asheville, where we have lots of writings, diary entries, letters, that sort of thing, that describe a column of African-American men following Stoneman out of Asheville. And so that got me interested in the 40th U.S. Colored Troops, and I started thinking, like, okay, so if George Avery's from Buncombe County, how many other Buncombe County men, Buncombe County African-American men, formerly enslaved men, were a part of this infantry unit? And it turns out almost 100. It's a huge amount of guys. And so The other one that I've gotten really fascinated with is Spencer Weaver, who also has this lost cause narrative surrounding the end of his life. There are two obituaries in Asheville papers, both with totally different stories that sort of use that lost cause language, referring to him as an old time darky, and how gallant and protective he was of the slave owners of his enslavers' property while the war was happening, and protected it from Kirk's raiders. But then, as you try to like piece out his life and figure out where he was and when, turns out he never actually lived in the home, or we can't prove that he ever lived in the home that he supposedly protected. There's no mention in those obituaries of his military service. He served 2 years in the military, and there's also no mention of him being involved with the YMI or as a founder of an African American congregation off what is now Lower Flat Creek Road. So, that stuff is completely left out, and it just makes me want to dig more and more. And so now I'm just going down the laundry list of men from Buncombe County who were in this infantry unit, and finding out that they are, and I knew this all along, but I feel like it's humanizing these people who have never had an opportunity to be humanized.
Right.
These stories that were completely usurped and taken over by former masters to promote a narrative of white supremacy and Southern heritage. So I think that Spence and George Avery and all the other 90 some odd folks in North Carolina from Buncombe County to serve in that unit are really fascinating, because it seems like, as I'm going down my list, it seems like the majority of them returned to Buncombe County, at least for some time, which I think is really fascinating.
100 African American men fighting for the United States Army during the Civil War. Sounds like the sort of people that should have a downtown monument.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the thing that really brought me to this was a monument in the Smith McDowell House, near the Smith McDowell House, that has both Union and Confederate soldiers. And as I was exploring around George Avery, I found a lot of these African American men missing. And I thought, well, if there's 2 or 3 of them missing, how many more are there?
Well, I look forward to hearing the outcomes of the research. I think it'll be great. I'd never heard of the 100 or so men, 40th U.S. colored troops from Buncombe County. I look forward to hearing all about it as it comes to fruition. Katherine, it's always a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Absolutely. And maybe we'll do it in person. Another symposium. The other brother.
Yeah. What about Bob? Yeah. No, it's maybe. It would be good. It'd be nice to just be able to go out and be able to talk to people in person again soon.
Yeah.
So take care. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.